Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back from the most recent break. My name is Taya Miles, and I was also a member of the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery Committee. It is my privilege to introduce our next panel, which is titled Innovative Approaches to Public Engagement with History. I'd like to begin by bringing in a bit of the spirit of the ceremony that took place outdoors, led by Dean Melissa Bartholomew and the Reverend Erica Williams, by saying that we are now on the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people, abutting the homelands of the Wampanoag and Nipmuc people. These nations are, of course, still here today, and there are members of the Harvard student body and staff who are members also of these nations. Oh, virtuous reader, you never knew what it was to be a slave, to be entirely unprotected by law or custom, to have the laws reduce you to the condition of chattel, entirely subject to the will of another. You never exhausted your ingenuity in avoiding the snares and eluding the power of a hated tyrant. You never shuddered at the sound of his footsteps and trembled within hearing of his voice. These are the words of the abolitionist Harriet Ann Jacobs, who was born into slavery in North Carolina, where she was physically and emotionally abused by the man who had legal claim to treat her as property, until she masterminded a brilliant escape and came north to settle in various places, including here in Cambridge. I take Jacobs at her word. We do not know. We do not know the full extent of what transpired in the corners of Southern plantations, the kitchens of Northern estates, the shadows of Harvard Yard, or the hearts and minds of the enslaved and their enslavers. But as much as slavery took place in private, it was a wholly public endeavor, carried out in the cold light of day and with the overt or tacit consent of much of the American public. Indigenous and African people were sold in public view at Wall Street in New York City and outside of the Customs House in Charleston, South Carolina. Fugitives from bondage were exposed and described in public newspapers. The fates of unfree people were weighed in courthouses. Debates about the spread of slavery rang through the halls of Congress and spilled over into the state houses and town squares. Authors, artists, abolitionists, and politicians took up the figure of the slave in their work and rhetoric. And just as slavery was a matter of public contention and public record before the Civil War, it remains part of our civic experience as residents and citizens today. Some of us may feel this public presence, this public haunting, more keenly than others. But all of us are affected by it as we navigate the landscapes, institutions, and cultures shaped in part by slavery and the ideological hold of racial hierarchy develops to justify and maintain it. Slavery was a private and public wrong, panoramic in scope and damage. Wrestling with its legacies, then, requires public engagement in the clear light of day. During our time together, we have listened to poetry, participated in ceremony, and learned about numerous historic sites in the South and the North. we have seen how multiple forms of translation and interpretation can yield new spaces for possibilities of connection. This panel will take us further into that topic. We will hear from visionary creatives and scholars in their fields. And they are Andrew Davenport, who is the manager of the Getting Word Oral History Project at the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. He is also a graduate student in American history at Georgetown University, researching a fascinating dissertation on the diaspora of enslaved people from Monticello. We will also hear from Dom Flemons, who is the co-founder of the Carolina Chocolate Drops, a musical phenomenon. He is a singer-songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, and music scholar. He is a Grammy winner and a 2-time Emmy nominee. Finally, we will hear from Honorée Fanon Jeffers, who is a poet, novelist, critic, and scholar. She is a professor of English at the University of Oklahoma, and she is the author of an intricate fictional family saga titled The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. The Love Songs won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Fiction in 2022 and was a finalist for the National Book Award for Fiction in 2021. And now I will hand the podium over to my colleague on the committee and our moderator, Mira Levinson, who is the Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson Professor of Education and Society at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thank you.
Thank you, Taya, for those words of wisdom and poetry. So my goal is actually not to talk to you for a long time because I really, really, really want to get into our poetry, our music, our history, et cetera. So I just want to say very briefly that there have been a couple of themes that I've been hearing over the course of today that I wanted to draw together just briefly. When President Bacow kicked us off this morning, he said that there have been some people who have contacted him saying, given all of the challenges that we face in the world, existential challenges, why are we looking backward, right, at something that is supposedly now over? And one of the answers that he gave, and that many people have given today, is that, of course, it is not the past, right, and that it shapes our present. But a second answer that I want to give is, I think, something that we have seen enacted throughout the day today, which is that, say, one of the challenges that I spend my time thinking about is the challenge of responding to the fragility of democracy. And how we can, we have always lived in a very fragile democracy, right? There are many who have question whether it's right to describe the United States as a democracy at all, given its foundations as a slaveocracy, given its foundations as a genocidal nation, and its refusal to truly spread democratic power, right, in an equitable and democratic way among our citizens, let alone also other residents, really throughout our history. But still, we do have elements of being a democracy that have been incredibly powerful for the world. And so the question is, right now, as we face challenges to US democracy, to Brazilian democracy, to Polish and Hungarian democracy, right, to democracies really around the world, how do we face up to those challenges except for actually insisting even stronger on the importance of public voice and our being able to come together as a diverse, multivocal people and assert our collective democratic power in order to not only preserve but also strengthen the civic features of our world that Taya was just mentioning to us. In order to achieve that, we have to reach some both collective understandings of truth, but also openness to challenge, right? Which is what we were hearing about in our last panel, right? How do we, our ability to stay grounded in ourselves while also realizing that what we thought we knew about ourselves might be wrong, and a willingness to work through that and come out the other side, and a willingness to engage with very, very, very different people and voices from ourselves, and to be open to the voices that have all too often been excluded, silenced, cast aside, discounted, right? And that is what I think we're going to get to experience today. This is one reason I'm super duper excited about this panel, because it's, I think, 3 phenomenal presentations about voice. The other thing that I want to say is, I'm an education geek. I was a middle school teacher for 8 years before I sort of came back to being an academic. And one of the things that is just incontrovertible is that students, no matter how old they are, come into schools with a lot of knowledge. Right? Knowledge from their families, knowledge from their communities, knowledge from their places of worship, from the places that they work, et cetera. And we are wrong if we think that what we teach in school either constitutes the totality of students' knowledge or even can be taught without regard to students' home knowledge, right? And so one of the reasons that I'm also really excited about today's panel is that we're going to be able to engage with 3 ways of thinking about the sources and conveyance of historical knowledge in public spaces. These are curricula that we're about to be exposed to. These are pedagogies of knowing and pedagogies of learning and collective teaching, that even though they happen outside of formal educative spaces like Harvard, are at least as powerful because of that. And that actually is one thing that gives me some hope as we, there have been a lot of references today to the ways in which a number of legislatures and governors have been trying to impose controls on what we teach and how we teach, which is that schools are only one small space of historical teaching and learning. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Honoré to get us started.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this gathering, which acknowledges and celebrates the legacies of our enslaved ancestors. I'm going to read 3 poems from The Age of Phyllis, my hybrid book of poetry that imagines the life and times of Phyllis Wheatley Peters and interprets primary and secondary research sources on early African Americans. The 3 poems that I will read represent enslaved Black women's emotional resistance, as well as my own resistance to the received narratives about slavery. I begin with an epigraph from the great Lucille Clifton. I say the stones marked an old tongue, and it was called eternity. Chorus of the mother's griot. Amnesiac wood, nostrils of girls, who was bought, uncle's hand, guts on the air, who was sold, defeated man, history's charnel. I say traitor silver, sailing knot to knot, naked in the corner, door of no return. Sing the mutiny in the slave house, sniff bougainvillea, who is ashamed. I say ready Don's kill, naked in the corner, jealous sharks. I shall, who did, I say, they did. I'm here. My name, who shall I say, yes, here. On the battlefield, call woman, call America, call revolution, call the brother, call the myth. I say, call the auction, Call Africa, call the Sachem. In God's name, is this call? Is my mother? Is some kin? I say, is this called? Is some water? Is my mother? I say, is this called? Isabel, Virginia Colony, circa 1621. Like any love should be, hers was touch and never leave. Some arguments and tears with Antony, her husband, but no freedom. They were tied, a curt blessing in that era of dark skin and kin. Separations would occur soon enough, but they had to band together. This woman and her man who might have come on a ship with 18 others. Isabel cooked for him from flesh he trapped or caught. They might have looked at the entrails of his prey to decipher what the day had been back home in Africa. What would the drums say? Was it a feast time? Was their village in the same spot? When their son was born, Isabel probably kept him away from others for several days. That night, when the necessary seclusion was done, Antony would have shaved the baby's head and spat in his ear, tapped a foot on the floor, told an unforgotten story. And then Isabel put the baby to her breast and sang, "Your name is William here, but mother calls you something else, something old in secret." This last poem is written in the voice of Belinda Sutton, who we used to know simply as Belinda, and I am very grateful to historians for reclaiming her name. For the first of several times, Belinda Sutton, former enslaved servant of the House of Isaac Royal, petitions the Massachusetts General Court for a pension in her old age. I shall trust the new word of this country, freedom. I shall not call the names of the dead. In that taken child's place, here is Belinda, toiling in unnatural cold. I ask for bits of what you sing, what you hold so dear. I say, I have a woman's memory. Men of war fingering silver or cowrie. Those men had no thought for me, only the blue in front. Cruel schemes, stricken drums. I say, I ask for less than what is written in some book or on the gathered conscience I know you have. More than that, too much. Understanding in this life remains a brick mansion. Pennies in exchange for what was taken from me. I say, I ask in my free God's names, the Orisha. Always they are here when I look around at this newfound place and I say, ocean, Obatala. I say, Shango, Yamaya. I say, Oya, Eshu, Elegbara. Like you, they sail and anchor where they please. And yes, they too crave. Thank you.
Thank you, Honoré. Andrew.
Thank you, Mira and Dom and Honoré. It's wonderful to be with you virtually, and of course, it's so wonderful to be with all of you here. And just honored to be here and so many people who I admire and respect so much professionally and personally. What I'd like to do in the 10 minutes or so that I have is give you an overview of the Getting Word project and its connections to Monticello, to describe its origins, and to show a little bit about how our research, some of the stories that emerge from our research of the project, which is now in its 29th year. And some of those stories will certainly intersect with Harvard too, and may be of interest to everyone here. I'll also talk a little bit about how dispersal sales following Thomas Jefferson's death affected African American families intergenerationally. So we'll describe that, and then we'll talk about things that are ongoing at Monticello and what we may have planned next. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, of course, Monticello is the home of Thomas Jefferson, and Charlottesville, Virginia was also home to 400 enslaved African Americans. Monticello is the neck of an hourglass. So if you can picture an hourglass in your mind, and you can look at that neck, and you can look through the hourglass in one way and see backward to colonial Virginia and colonial America. If you turn the hourglass over the other way, you can see out through the 19th and 20th and into the 21st century. So let's keep that in mind, being able to look at Monticello as this looking glass, as this hourglass. Getting Word itself is in its 29th year. It is an oral history project. It focuses on the descendants of people enslaved at Monticello by Thomas Jefferson. We document and preserve family histories, and we've been doing it since the early 90s. We have over 225 oral history interviews with descendants of people enslaved by Jefferson, and we're also a research project. And we host reunions at Monticello for Getting Word participants. We've done that several times in the past generation or so. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the founders of the project. Lucia Cinder Stanton, Cinder is her nickname. Cinder is Harvard class of 65. She is the founder of Getting Word. She had been at Monticello for 25 years prior to founding Getting Word. And in her own telling, she never truly considered what happened to enslaved families. She never really believed the story of Thomas Jefferson's paternity of Sally Hemings' children until she met Madison Hemings' descendants in the early 90s, and of course, until after meeting Professor Annette Gordon-Reed as well and reading her work. Cinder co-founded Getting Word with Dr. Diane Swan Wright, who was my mentor. She passed away 4 years ago, a brilliant oral historian. Diane liked to say that oral history is a favorite way of passing on information. So if you can remember being a little child and talking to your grandparents, and your grandparents would just pour their stories into you, and then you would become the vessel for your elder stories. Diane was all about that. She was a brilliant interpreter, a brilliant interviewer of African American life. The two of them came together in the early 90s, 1993. They came together across economic lines and racial lines and social lines to co-found Getting Word. They traveled 40,000 miles over the course of about 20 years together, interviewing a couple hundred descendants of people enslaved at Monticello. Since Cinder's retirement in 2012, the project has been overseen at the International Center for Jefferson Studies by Aurelia Crawford and Naya Bates, who's now a PhD candidate at Princeton, and I have been the director of the project for the past year almost. This is an advertisement of enslaved people following Thomas Jefferson's death. This is 6 months after Jefferson died. Of course, he died July 4th, 1826. This is mid-January, 1827. You can see that enslaved people were sold with furniture and animals. The sale took 5 days, and we know hundreds of local men were present for those sales. Jefferson owned about 200 enslaved people at the time of his death, about 130 at Monticello, 70 more in Bedford County at his private retreat, Poplar Forest. everyone would be sold in an attempt to cover his debts. We have records for 75, records of who purchased 75 enslaved people, but the vast majority of folks who were sold, we do not know who they were purchased by. We have just one or two firsthand accounts of the dispersal sales. This one from Peter Fawcett, who was age 11 when he was sold in 1827. He said, "We were scattered all over the country, never to see each other until we were to meet again in another world." Fawcett was one of about 8 or 9 siblings, all of whom were put on the auction block on the west lawn of Monticello. That's the nickel view that you have on your coin. The nickel view of Monticello is where we believe about 126 or so enslaved people were sold over the course of 5 days, January 1827. Peter Fawcett was 11 years old. At the end of the 19th century, Peter Fawcett returned to Monticello and he gave a newspaper interview. He had been enslaved afterwards in Central Virginia until in 1850. His family purchased him and brought him to Ohio. And in 1898, he told a newspaper reporter exactly what happened to he and his family over the course of those days. We were scattered all over the country. To give you an example, here is a representation of the work that we have done. This is truly out of Cinder Stanton's research. This is where everyone went following the dispersal sales. Missouri, Alabama, Wisconsin, Ohio, West Virginia, up to Massachusetts for people who were free, okay, and Liberia. Brown Colbert was in exchange for leaving Virginia, he was sent to Liberia, where he died almost immediately in the 1830s. This is a map detailing everyone's movement that we're aware of between 1826 and 1865. One of the people sold, Peter Fawcett's sister, Anne Elizabeth Fawcett Isaacs is her name. She married Tucker Isaacs, who was of African American and Jewish ancestry, also from Charlottesville. She was about 15 years old when she was sold. She would ultimately gain her freedom in 1837 and settle in southern Ohio in Chillicothe. And a photo there on what is my right in the back of the room is of the Isaacs home place in Chillicothe. It's Getting Word historian Beverly Gray at the Isaacs home place. Of course, her grandson, William Monroe Trotter, Harvard, class of 1895, first African American to receive the Phi Beta Kappa key, also a graduate with a graduate degree in 1896. An amazing story. His grandmother freed in 1837. Most everyone else from the dispersal sales, of course, had to experience a generation more of slavery. But we know Anne Elizabeth Fawcett Isaacs' story, and we know some of her descendants' stories, and we know William Monroe Trotter was a radical, black radical, as the biography by Carrie Greenidge has it, right? And a true representative American, a co-founder of the Niagara movement, which ultimately became the NAACP, a journalist here in Massachusetts. But there are others whose stories did not begin in freedom before in the antebellum age. This is a photo of Lucy Cottrell, who was purchased by a professor at the UVA and taken forcibly to Maysville, Kentucky from Charlottesville. This is a photo, 1845, of Lucy Cottrell with her ward, a white child. And there were those who were forcibly transported to Alabama. Pictured here are descendants of Jupiter Evans. Jupiter Evans and Thomas Jefferson, born the same year, the same plantation, 1743, Shadwell Plantation, Albemarle County. And Jupiter Evans' descendants were enslaved by the Randolph line for 8 generations. And to this day, Jupiter Evans' descendants live within about a mile or 2 of Thomas Jefferson's descendants in a tiny town in northern Alabama, where I have been and conducted interviews with some of the youngest children pictured in this photograph here. Their experiences were vastly different from those who were freed in Thomas Jefferson's will or who remained enslaved in Virginia. a photo of Reverend Robert Hughes, and a receipt for his sale. A preacher, a founder of Zion Hill Baptist Church and Union Run Baptist Church, just 2 or 3 miles from Monticello. Reverend Hughes's great-great-grandson is pictured in the middle of this photograph. He's an archivist with the Getting Word Project. And for the past year, Calvin Jefferson, great-great-grandson of Robert Hughes, and also a descendant of the Granger and Hemmings families enslaved by Jefferson, Calvin has been archiving 30 years of our project, because in the fall we received a $375,000 grant from the NEH to archive professionally and digitize this project for the very first time. All 30 years, tens of thousands of accumulated files. This is about 1/3 of the files that we have. Also pictured here, promising public historian Jenna Owens and our archivist Suzanne Holt. And they've gone painstakingly, page by page, through each of these files that Cinder Stanton and Diane Swan Wright, all of these oral history transcripts, everything that they've accumulated in an attempt to find out what happened to families after Jefferson's death. In 2018, we hosted the most recent reunion of descendants. About 300 people returned, participants in the Getting Word Project. They're standing on the same exact site where their ancestors were most likely sold in 1827. We are recontextualizing what Monticello is and what this country can be by doing this kind of work in the age of repair. I was present for this as well, as was my grandmother and 5 of her first cousins. Her grandfather is pictured there. His name is Anderson Jefferson Robinson. And his father and 3 of his grandparents were sold in dispersal sales in 1827, 1829. This is a history I would not have known if it were not for Dr. Diane Swan Wright, for Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, for Cinder Stanton, for Gail Jessup White, my cousin. And it's because of that work that my life has become immeasurably enriched. To meet all of these community members, to meet people who I am related to do this kind of work, to be mentored by Dr. Diane Swan Wright, to know Professor Gordon-Reed's work so well, and to know all of these people. Institutions can and should do this kind of work. They should reconnect families if possible. They should try. And that's what I'll leave you with. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Don.
Well, hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be at the panel with you today, and it's a pleasure to be with all these wonderful scholars and historians and poets. And for my presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about my album, Don Flemons Presents Black Cowboys, which came out on Smithsonian Folkways recordings in 2018. I began to do this project because I was born and raised in Phoenix, Arizona. As a Mexican-American and African-American man, on my Mexican-American side, I'm 6th generation Phoenix, Arizona. And on my African-American side, my father is a native of Flagstaff, Arizona, and my grandparents came from East Texas and Arkansas to find a better life for themselves outside of the farm. And so my grandfather was a preacher and a sawmill worker as well. So I went to college at Northern Arizona University, where the mascot is the Lumberjacks. So for me, the history is very personal in one way. And in another way, when I began to find information about African-American cowboys and later the Black West, because of course, as we've seen in the 2 previous presentations, this story of African-American work, artistry, and excellence goes far beyond just one single type of life and one type of way that people decided to handle the legacy that was given to them. And so in a certain way, when I pitched the album to Smithsonian Folkways to be a part of the African American Legacy Series, which is a part of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which I was very fortunate to have been a part of the opening ceremonies, I knew that this was going to be a very important project. Not so much that I needed to get every piece of information, but I wanted to have a comprehensive overview of the Black West. And why I decided to do this, I'm going to read a small quote from the liner notes. Now, if you're tuning in online, we're going to drop in the chat the lyrics to the song I've chosen, He's a Lone Ranger, which I've chosen to demonstrate. And then also there is a link from Smithsonian Folkways website. They offer a free PDF of the liner notes. And I also wrote a 40-page liner note to try to be as comprehensive as possible. Because as I tour around as a musician, I find I go to museums quite often, Western museums as well. And I found the tendency was that they might have one or two Black Western books or some type of material connected to the museum. So the album was also an attempt to have a comprehensive all-in-one package so that people that may not know about Black Western history might be able to be informed. One of the quotes that really moved me as I began to research some of the information, because the who, what, when, and where were all very easy to find, and there was lots of information in the library. But the why it was relevant to people was what continued to elude me. And it wasn't until I read the autobiography of one of the famous Black cowboys, Nat Love, and he began to tell his story about being born into slavery, then becoming a cowboy, and then later becoming a Pullman porter, that I found a particular relevance to this post-slavery era, and also how it leads into the early parts of the civil rights movement. So that was something that just blew my mind, and I had not seen that before. It also changed the lens of focus so that no longer were the Black cowboys, in my mind, erased wholesale, but they moved to different places. They found different areas to go, and they found different types of work. So they were not documented as the cowboys and the important parts of the West that they truly were in their day. And one of the quotes that I found was from a wonderful 2010 interview with Mike Searless from University of Georgia. And he said, "Many people see the West as the birthplace of America. If they only see it as the birthplace of white America, it basically means that all other people are interlopers. They're not a part of what makes an American. But if we understand that African Americans were cowboys, even Native Americans were cowboys, Mexicans were cowboys, it really opens up the door for us to think about America as a multi-ethnic, multiracial place, not just in the last decade or century, but from the very beginning." And with statements like that, I was drawn to bring 18 different stories of the Black West together. The one I've decided to share with you this time is a song that I wrote called He's a Lone Ranger, after reading about the Deputy U.S. Marshal of the United States, Bass Reeves, who was from Fort Smith, Arkansas, and born into slavery. And he is said to be the historical precedent for the fictional character, the Lone Ranger. And of course, I had to run after this story and try to learn as much as I could. And I took pieces from two different books, Art T. Burton's Black Gun, Silver Star, as well as Gary Paulson's The Legend of Bass Reeves, to tell the story. And so in the liner notes, I wrote this song to pay tribute to the story of Bass Reeves, who was born into slavery in 1838. He grew up in the Texarkana region of the South and lived with his mother and master on the plantation. As a young boy, he encountered Native Americans while hunting for snakes and rabbits on the trails near his home. And as he grew older, his master taught him how to ride a horse and shoot a gun to defend the plantation during the Indian Wars. And when he became a young man, the master challenged him to a game of poker with his freedom as collateral. Reeves discovered that the master had been cheating and confronted him, knocking him unconscious. Reeves was forced to flee the plantation, and during the time he spent as an outlaw, he befriended and lived amongst the Cherokee Nation, learned their language, and became an expert at mapping out the Indian Territory, as it was known at that time. In 1875, he was recruited by the hanging judge, Isaac C. Parker, to become a deputy U.S. Marshal, the very first African-American west of the Mississippi to hold that position, after Frederick Douglass, no less. He was known as an expert rider, marksman, and master of homemade disguises. And Bass Reeves scoured the Indian Territory for rustlers, rogue Native Americans, and bootleggers, bringing hundreds of criminals to justice, 3,000 in total. And he later settled in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And the facts and folklore around Bass Reeves are extraordinary, and his legacy remains a likely inspiration for the fictional character, the Lone Ranger. So without further ado, I'm going to have a video that I've pre-recorded of me playing my song, He's a Lone Ranger. And I'll talk a little bit about the lyrics as well as the music after that.
He's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a U.S. Marshal and a country with a star on his breast. Every white man and a Indian tribe. He was the baddest man that ever was alive. He's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a Lone Ranger, Bass Reeves his name. Broad-shouldered and 6 feet tall, rode a sorrel that could outrun them all. Master of a pistol, master of disguise. He looked every man he caught now dead in the eyes. 'Cause he was a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a Lone Ranger, Bass Reeves his name. On a slave down in Arkansas, lived with his master and his dear old mom. Mom said, son, you ain't free, but you can do anything you want, though if the mister don't see. Now he's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a Lone Ranger, Bass Reeves his name. Master called Bass Reeves to a gambling game. Bass's freedom was the stake that he made. No master cheated, you ought to heard the sound of Bass's hoof beats as Master hit the ground. Now he's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a Lone Ranger, Bass Reeves his name. Yo! Bass Reeves break into song, get down to business and it won't be long. We're in Muskogee, 100 miles around, they call him Bass Reeves. He's bound to track you down, 'cause he's a U.S. Marshal and a Lone Ranger. He's a Lone Ranger, Bass Reeves his name. Walking around.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I know I don't have a lot of time, but just to speak a little bit about the music for the album Black Cowboys, one of the people who really inspired me, who also recorded on Folkways, was this wonderful gentleman, Lightning Hopkins from Centerville, Texas. And I used his music as a template to talk about Bass Reeves' story. I found him to be such an epic character of the West. I knew that he needed a blues shuffle in the style of Lightning Hopkins. I believe there's one called Fan It on that particular record. I also was very inspired by the recordings of the great Hughie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly. And so this album, the Library of Congress recordings, was an essential recording for me. And also another early songster who I record 2 of his songs on the album, Henry Ragtime Texas Thomas from East Texas, who recorded in the late 1920s for the Vocalion record label, was very much an influence. That's his album, Texas Worried Blues. And I would be amiss if I did not mention one of my good friends, Charlie Siemens, who is a folklorist who did a lot of work on cowboy material in general, which was a template for how I would take the idea of what we know about cowboys and apply it to African American cowboys, because I didn't want it to be a separate endeavor. I wanted to show that during those early days of the West, there was not room for discrimination because of the nature of the band of brothers of a small group of cowboys. There wasn't room for people to abuse each other in that type of way. And there was one famous black cowboy, Bones Hooks, who mentioned, "Any man who would abuse me on the trail, I knew would not be there long because he would not last on the range." And so that was one of many epiphanies I found when searching out this early history. It really, people had different perspectives as they moved out west, and they moved to places that were undocumented jurisdictions in the United States at that time, and it really tells a lot about the way that the United States was born. But this album, Back in the Saddle Again, is a history of cowboy material that tells a little bit of the history of recorded cowboy music. And then, of course, another Arizona native, Marty Robbins, Gunfighter Ballad and Trail Songs. I was very much influenced when I wanted to sequence the album out, because this album is still one of the most popular Western albums of all time, and I wanted to figure out a way to make the story of black cowboys appealing for all. And that's about all the time I've got for you folks. Thank you again for having me. It's a pleasure to be a part of the panel.
Thank you, Dom. I'm just so filled with joy and with actually melancholy from our combined presentations, and I feel these wrestling inside my heart. So I appreciate all three of you so much. I want to start actually with a question about artistic production, and we'll start with you, Honore, and then move to Dom. So one of the things that I actually found extremely moving about the release of the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery report on Tuesday was its exemplification of, I think, some of the best of the digital humanities and its integration of text with visuals, with photographs, artifacts, all places where you can go deeper, where you can decide, I'm going to let this wash over me, or no, I want to follow it through. There's also a walking tour that I've not yet gone on, but that I'm really, I don't know that excited is the right word, but I feel compelled to do the walking tour next week, which I know features the voices of Harvard students and many other voices and sounds. And as I think about how we are going to lift up the findings in this report and then respond to them, right? Because the call all day has rightly been about memory leading to action and knowledge leading to action. I think I've been somewhat blinkered in my thinking about the kinds of artistic productions that might enable us to engage in collective memory making and action. I think of monuments, of solid structures, physical structures on campus spaces. And then I think about things like the walking tour and the digital humanities. But what you are bringing to us is a whole array of ways of thinking about how the arts can teach us and form spaces for collective engagement and understanding, and touch us and educate us and provide possibilities for conversation and action in different ways. So Honore, can you just start us off, and then Dom, I'll turn to you.
Okay, that's a lot to process.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm processing too.
But first, very quickly, let me say, Brother Dom, that was beautiful, and I think what was interesting is the way, the arc of it, right? Because there is this melancholy. You may have seen me crying during the second presentation, and then there was that sort of joy. And I sang with a blues band back in graduate school, so that just really, just was just so good, just extra good. I think in terms of the work that I do, I think about the great Saidiya Hartman talking about critical fabulation, and the arts are, I think, a particular place where we can take the archives and use that, you know, as the sort of scaffolding, and then through the imagination, you know, of the arts, we can fill in what we don't know. And you know, as you know, this gathering of scholars knows, you go back, you can only go back so far for most African Americans. That's why I was so greatly moved by the second presentation, because, you know, my people, I can only go to, you know, the 1870 census for my mother's people. So I think that it's very, very important, but I also think that what is needed, if I may, is to allow the title of scholar to be given to artists as well. You know, I was very lucky, and then I'll sort of wrap up, to have the fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society, which is where I really began my work on Phyllis Wheatley Peters, my research in earnest. I was very, very lucky that my work was respected. But artists are not always respected for the work that we do. Even though you will see that so many scholars also, I'm thinking of the great Du Bois, who was a very accomplished creative writer. So I think that we're going to have to allow these spaces to open up and to respect artists in the archives. And I won't get messy and say places I haven't been respected, but one of them is in Boston.
Thank you, Honoré. Before we turn to Dom, I want to note that I do think it's fitting that we are here at Radcliffe, which has, throughout the history of the Institute, really respected artists as scholars and scholars as having possibilities actually to learn how to be artists. And so I'm glad that we are a welcoming space, at least at this moment here. Dom, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, there are so many ways to be able to handle history. I think especially in the 21st century, we're in a spot where there has been so much extended access, where we have information that may have taken years to have uncovered beforehand if you were just doing microfilm, if you go back far enough in that type of scholarly research. But now there are so many digitized archives. And then also, as an individual scholar, there are places that we can go where we have perspectives that are much greater than maybe 100 years ago, where some of the major scholarship was done. You know, some of the foundational books we find, there is new information that's out there. And when I was doing Black Cowboys specifically, I found that there was so much information that once I brought it all together, I found I had hundreds of books. I didn't realize I would find hundreds of books on Black Cowboys and Black Western culture, but there I was. And then I had to figure out how to condense that information down to something that would be readable for the general public, as well as for an academic and scholarly public. So I decided to use an extended bibliography, and I wanted to also make a case that instead of focusing on what we don't know, I wanted to focus on the things that I found, the things that actually were there, and honoring the actual history instead of spending a lot of time fighting the history that wasn't being told. And so I always approached this particular project in that manner, where it was actively moving forward. My own family history, I never spoke with my grandparents about this deeper history of the Western migration, but as I began to read about the history in of itself, their stories illuminated in a way that I never would have imagined. And I'll give you just an example from the LP. So one of the ways I was able to repurpose the imagery of the West, so getting to know Timothy Duffy, he works with a wet plate collodion camera, a Deardorff 11x14. So we made a lot of portraits of old-time tintypes to reference the West, because that's a lot of the way that we think of the West in imagery, is through tintype photography. So that's one way we handled it on there. And then the other half was taking historical images here, like, for example, this young boy right here, this is my father in Texas with his cousin growing up. And then this is my grandfather and grandmother. I know I have to get it real close in there. You have to go on the Folkways website to see these things up close. But there are some beautiful images of my grandparents. But then also connecting with Smithsonian Folkways, we were able to access the Library of Congress. And we found some beautiful images such as this picture of the Buffalo Soldiers in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where they stationed for many years. And just being able to bring all of the information into one package and to be able to put it in a place where we are giving dignity to this history in a way that it may not have been given during its actual day or even decades afterward, that was something that I felt was very important. And when it came to writing the song He's a Lone Ranger, I decided to put little social ideas that are part of the West, such as the second verse is that he's broad-shouldered and 6 feet tall. He rode a sorrel that could outrun them all. Bass Reeves was a master of a pistol and a master of disguise, which I spoke of, and he looked every man he caught dead in the eye, which is just a small social cue, going back to those old days where, where eye-to-eye contact was not something that was okay for most black people to do next to a white person. And just to be able to show that dynamic with a person like Bass Reeves, I will just relate one final story that I found when I was reading the biography of Bill Pickett, just to kind of show you where a lot of these early Western pioneers were in terms of mentally. So Bill Pickett always would carry a little tin cup with him. Now, the reason he would do this, as a rodeo entertainer, he was often offered a drink after his performances. Now, if this was a white man that offered the drink, one, the cup would allow Bill Pickett to drink without drinking too much, so he would never be seen drunk. And he also allowed him not to share the bottle physically with whoever gave him a drink, so he would always have it in a cup. So if someone saw him interacting with someone, they were never touching the same bottle. And then also, it also let people know that he was friendly enough so that they could offer him a drink, and so that he would be able to have some sort of camaraderie with the people that enjoyed his show. And that just kind of shows you where some of these early pioneers were at mentally. They were thinking on multiple levels because of the legacy that they had received, just from the nature of their upbringing and growing up, and then their adult life as well. Because of course now it gave me a much deeper appreciation of racial uplift and economic uplift as well, because this story also speaks about some of these basic tenets of civil rights. And so that was one way I wanted to do it creatively. And my 3 songs that were original, I wrote about Bill Pickett, Nat Love, and Bass Reeves. But then I also wanted to incorporate traditional songs, half of them songs that are within the Western canon, such as Home on the Range and Goodbye Old Paint, and present some of the black cowboy stories associated with the birth of those songs and the documentation of those songs, while sidestepping it with some of the Southern traditions that traveled out west as well, including fiddle and banjo music, the blues, and country music. And so it was sort of a way to juxtapose all of these things so that people could hear the history as well as see it.
Thank you, Dom. That was amazing. I want to turn to you, Andrew, and you ended your remarks with a charge to us. To identify and bring together descendants. And that is one of the recommendations in the Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery report, that we start to do that in some way. And I'm wondering if you can expand on why. I mean, that may seem obvious, but I think you've thought deeply about this, so I think it's important for us to reflect on why descendant communities matter, and also how. I was struck in Jody's talk about the Lemon Project this morning about the initiative at William and Mary to educate local community members, some of whom may also themselves be descendants, in learning historical archival research and genealogical methods. And so that's gotten me thinking about the various ways in which we may support further research, incorporate the voices, how much should happen on Harvard's campus? You know, we can hire postdocs who can do work. How much should happen out in among communities? How far should our communities go, right? There's an entire section of the report that's, I think, very important on the Caribbean. So anyway, that's a lot. You can choose to answer whichever you want to.
Sure. Thank you, Mira. I try to be a good Catholic, and I think there's a moral obligation when you do wrong to approach those that you have affected negatively. And so for an institution like Harvard to do the research necessary to find people, and I know that I found some descendants, but there's a moral obligation to reach out and engage and listen. And that was the takeaway that I had from Jody Allen this morning, these listening tours. You know, Monticello is on an ongoing process. We're going to continue to do it for as long as the Thomas Jefferson Foundation is around. And we have this incredible archive of these oral histories collected over decades. And Georgetown doing something similar with the Georgetown Slavery Archive and the Georgetown Memory Project. Sitting at someone's feet and asking them and listening to what they have to tell you is a sacred act. And so whatever Harvard decides to do, you will learn from those that you are ultimately going to meet, and they'll tell you what you can do, right? And so if it is an impulse toward learning how to do archival research, or if it's an impulse toward doing professional genealogy, or you'll also learn that people don't want to hear from you at all, right? And that is perfectly acceptable. That's the nature of this kind of work, but you can at least try to do that.
Thank you, Andrew. I want to turn to some of the questions that are coming in from audience members, and I'm going to remind you that you can keep on sending in the questions. And I want to start with a question that is directed toward you, Andrew, although then I actually want to invite Honoré in part, given Honoré your response to Andrew's presentation, which is how do you manage your own emotions in this work? Because, you know, I think about what we've been seeing in recent years following the initial sort of reactivation of Black Lives Matter and the shocking number of young activists who have died through their work and the toll that it takes. And so this is we were talking earlier about how young people come, say, to these historic houses as whole bodies, right? That we are not merely minds, we are not merely scholars, we are not merely writers, we are all of us, we are children, right? We are descendants. And so it seems in order to sustain this work, as if we have to attend, those of you who are bringing this out, right, have to attend to yourselves, but your work is so hard and so important. So how do you do it? And then Honoré, I'll turn to you.
I have a long commute from DC to Charlottesville, and I listen to comedy on my way home. And that helps quite a bit. But on a serious note, it's about the people, and you want to cherish the people. And so when we do this kind of work and we go out and we give talks, and if it's at Harvard or if it's in Charlottesville or if it's online, whatever, yes, it's an incredibly difficult subject. This is hard history, as we all know. But someone will reach out and they will say, I have an oral history, or my family's from Albemarle County, and I heard that there may be a connection, or there is a connection, or no one's ever listened to me before, will you listen to me now? I hear from people many times a month in small, deep southern towns who have a connection to Central Virginia ancestrally. They've learned through their family oral history or census records that they have a great-grandparent in some cases from Virginia or from Maryland who were forcibly transported to Mississippi or Alabama. And so, yes, it's emotional, but when you go out and you do this, you will hear from others, and every time you give one talk, you might be able to connect another family, people longing for connection. So that's how I try and deal with it. It's about the people and the reunions and good comedy on the way home.
Thank you. Honore.
Well, I just really want to thank Brother Andrew for this important work that he's doing. It's greatly moving and greatly important. For me, I think I'm the oldest person on the panel, and I'm from the Deep South. So I'm an unabashed God lover, and I pray. I look at this work as attending of ancestral altars. I don't expect everybody to look at things the way that I look at, and I feel like you should respect, everybody's approach. For me, it became very apparent, probably because my mentor and my second mother, Lucille Clifton, was a visioning woman, and I'm a visioning woman. And so it became that's something that I can only really speak on. I haven't been able to speak on it for probably only about 2 years. But I have a spiritual practice. But I also think that I have had to constantly change my self-care. I now do yoga nearly every day. I try not to eat meat much anymore. These are these sort of things because the older you get, it will settle on you. It'll settle on your spirit. But if you have a calling, and you feel like this is a calling, this is a ministry, you have to do it. But it takes a toll on you. And so when I was writing The Age of Phyllis, and then I'll wrap up, I used to watch, Brother Andrew listens to comedy. I used to watch old videos on YouTube of Sesame Street. You see the little babies, and they're, most of them are my age now, but you see them and they're interacting with the puppets, like the puppets are real. And then sometimes I would watch videos of Mr. Rogers. And it just kind of, just that sort of kindness that you see. Then it allows you to understand that all is not ugliness. And the last thing though is I think about, no matter the horror that I encounter, I'm here. And that is a triumph. And that is a joy. And my ancestors prayed for this moment. My mother's father could not read and write. Here I am presenting at Harvard. So it's a choice.
So with that, I want to wrap up with a question to each of the three of you. And why don't we go in opposite order? So we'll go Dom, Andrew, and ending with Honore. And this is a bit of an amalgamation of some questions that have come in, which is that, yes, what you just talked about, Honore, the fact that you are here at Harvard, is, I think, part of what I heard, particularly from both you and Dom, about your effort to weave African American history and people much more fully and self-evidently and inexplicably into the American story. And I mean, in fact, that's something I find really inspiring about your work, Dom, is that when I've done interviews with young people of color, especially around the United States, there's such a distinction where these native-born American citizens will talk about Americans, meaning whites, particularly when we're talking about, say, tropes like cowboys, right? That's always them. And part of what you are doing is saying, no, it's us, right? This is collective, that anywhere you look, we are a multiracial, a multi-ethnic, a multivocal community. And so I would love to hear from each of you about one way in which you either feel good about what you've done in terms of creating this tapestry, or one thing that you're hoping to do next. So, Dom, let's start with you.
Well, just to speak of a couple of ways that I've been very happy with the project I've put out there. Since 2018, to see a proliferation of black cowboys as a subject matter in multiple types of popular culture has been brilliant. In an age where everyone talks about the entire process, I told no one about my Black Cowboys album. So when I presented it without the influence of a lot of other people outside of the scholars in which I was consulting. One of the reasons I wanted to do that was I thought that it was a story as someone from the Southwest. A lot of the main manifesto of civil rights and the African American struggle is based in the Deep South. And the Southwest and sometimes Western black culture tends to be a fringe culture and a fringe history. And so when I began to read about these amazing people that were out there, and of course I mostly focused within the 1860s to the 1960s more or less, but the story of black cowboys goes all the way back to Hispaniola, Estefanico, and many of the early African pioneers that came with the conquistadores and a lot of the Spanish missionaries. And so just to be able to put that out there so that younger people, older people, any person, whether they are black or American or anyone, can now see some aspect of black Western culture. And of course with music, it's very easy to be able to wrap words and music together. And in some ways that also allows, in a way, for the listener to transcend a lot of the pain and hurt by just having philosophical discussions within the lyric content that's a part of the project. And that was
Great.
one thing I want to focus on, because
I'm just going to cut you off because I'm aware of time, and I'm sorry. Thank you, Dom. I'm going to turn to Andrew.
10 minutes.
I'm sorry. I really want to make sure Sven's panel gets as much time as we've gotten.
Honoré, I would turn it over to you. I am far more interested in hearing what you have to say about your work and what's next with the limited time we have.
So gentlemanly. Thank you, Brother Andrew. I feel like what I've tried to do is, the other 4 of my books of poetry were for me, but The Age of Phyllis was for the people. And so it's been, very, it's been lovely, to see, college kids tell me that they now sort of get her work. What I would like to see is just simply more folks, doing this kind of work. And so there we are.
Thank you to all 3 of you, and I'm looking forward to Harvard following your lead and hopefully our being able to actually learn how to do some of this work alongside of you and support it. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.